The vast Great Plains stretched endlessly beneath the sky, a sea of grass where silence was broken only by the wind. Then, the sound came a distant thunder that wasn't from the clouds above, but from the hooves of countless horses tearing across the land. The Plains tribes had found a new way to fight, to hunt, to live, and with it, they would dominate the battlefield in ways that shocked their enemies. But how did the horse, once unknown to this land, turn entire nations into legends of war? Let's find out. Before the horse returned to the Americas, the plains stretched wide and unforgiving. Tribes traveled on foot, dragging their belongings on wooden travois pulled by dogs. Hunting the great bison required stamina, coordination, and sometimes deadly risk. Life was harsh, and warfare, though present, was limited in scale and speed. But in the 16th century, everything changed. When the Spanish brought horses to the New World, they could not have imagined the transformation they unleashed. Some escaped, multiplying in the wild, carving out herds that roamed freely. Slowly, they spread northward, becoming a force of nature in themselves. By the 17th century, the first Plains tribes encountered these magnificent animals. At first, they were creatures of mystery, fast, powerful, almost otherworldly. But soon, they were captured, tamed, and cherished. The horse was no longer just an animal. It was a gift, a spiritual ally, and the beginning of a new chapter in native warfare. The sound of hooves replaced the silence of grass. Where once warriors walked, they now thundered across the horizon, striking fear into those unprepared for their swiftness. This was the first thunder of hooves, the rebirth of battle itself. To the Lakota, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, and many others, the horse was more than a tool, it was sacred. Stories arose that these animals were gifts from the spirit world, beings sent to bond with the people. They were called the Horse Nation, living allies whose strength became the tribe's strength. Owning a horse was a symbol of honor, wealth, and power. A warrior's status was measured by the size of his herd, and entire families were elevated by their mastery of horsemanship. Tribes traded, raided, and fought fiercely to acquire more horses, knowing that each one expanded their reach, their hunting power, their ability to wage war. And the horse was not just for war. It reshaped every aspect of life. No longer did hunters risk their lives chasing bison on foot. From horseback, they could ride alongside the massive beasts, loosing arrows with unmatched precision. What once took hours of toil could now be achieved in a single sweep across the plains. The Horse Nation gave speed, mobility, and power, but it also gave pride. Young boys grew up in the saddle, learning to ride before they could walk steadily. Girls learned to race and manage herds, securing their family's wealth. The people of the plains were no longer bound by the limits of distance. With horses, the horizon was theirs to claim. The horse did not just change hunting, it transformed warriors. From a young age, boys trained endlessly, their legs gripping the horse's sides until balance was second nature. They could fire arrows at full gallop, leaning low to the animal's neck or hanging from its side to shield themselves from enemy fire. Battles were no longer slow, cautious encounters. They became storms of speed and movement. A single warrior on horseback could strike with the force of many, darting in and out of combat before an enemy even raised his weapon. Raids could span hundreds of miles, carried out with terrifying precision, as entire bands of warriors swept across rival lands. To ride into war was not only a matter of skill, it was a sacred act. Warriors painted their horses with symbols of power, brushed their coats with sacred herbs, and whispered prayers before battle. Each horse became an extension of its rider's spirit, a partner bound in destiny. The sight of warriors on horseback was breathtaking and terrifying. To enemies, they appeared like shadows of the wind, here one moment and gone the next, striking with speed that seemed impossible. Warfare had been reborn, and the Plains tribes stood as masters of this new way of battle. The brilliance of Plains warfare lay not in sheer numbers, but in speed, cunning, and precision. Unlike the European style of battle-rigid formations, muskets fired in volleys. The Plains tribes struck like lightning. Raids were fast, often at dawn, when the enemy's defenses were weakest. Horses galloped in with warriors bent low, arrows whistling, lances thrusting, and just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished into the endless grasslands. Enemies called it ghost war. Armies sent to pursue them often found nothing but tracks fading into the prairie winds. To chase Plains warriors on horseback was to chase smoke across the horizon. No fortress, no caravan, no settlement was safe from their reach. Raids were not always about bloodshed. They were about power, prestige, and above all, horses. To steal a rival's herd was to cripple his strength, to rob him of wealth and honor. A warrior who returned with captured horses earned renown. His deeds sung in camp circles beneath the stars. For the tribes, these lightning strikes were more than tactics. They were tradition, a test of courage and cunning. They shaped warriors into legends, their names whispered across the plains. For enemies, however, they were a nightmare that no wall of soldiers could withstand. The battlefield of the Great Plains was unlike any other. It was not confined to narrow valleys or castle walls. It was a boundless sea of grass. And here, the horse made every warrior a master of strategy. Plains fighters perfected techniques that left their foes bewildered. They used feigned retreats, drawing enemies into reckless pursuit before circling back in a deadly ambush. They rode in spirals, loosing arrows with uncanny accuracy, never giving their opponents a still target. Some warriors even trained to lean completely off their horse's side, firing from beneath the animal's neck, their bodies hidden from enemy fire. Communication was swift, almost instinctive. A gesture of a lance, a shout carried on the wind, and whole bands moved as one. Unlike the rigid discipline of European or American troops, these warriors flowed like water, adapting with each heartbeat of battle. And their tactics were not only offensive, they could vanish just as easily, dispersing into the prairie before the enemy could regroup. No supply train could keep pace, no infantry could catch them, and cavalry from the outside world often found themselves clumsy and overmatched. On the open plains, the tribes were not just skilled, they were unbeatable. They had turned horsemanship into an art of war, and their mastery was such that even armies with guns and cannons struggled against their mobility and precision. Behind every raid, every battle, stood the structure of war societies, sacred brotherhoods that bound warriors together with ritual, honor, and duty. Among the Lakota, there were the Kit Fox Society and the Strong Heart Society. Among the Cheyenne, the Dog Soldiers rose to prominence, fierce defenders of their people who became both protectors and avengers. These societies were not mere military groups, they were spiritual orders. Each had its own songs, dances, and sacred objects. Members pledged loyalty not only to each other, but to the spirits themselves, vowing to fight with bravery even when the odds were impossible. A warrior's life was measured by deeds, not years. To ride boldly into the storm of battle was to honor the ancestors. Counting coup touching an enemy with a hand or weapon without killing him was considered the highest act of courage, a mark that one had risked everything to prove his spirit. The horse was at the heart of this sacred duty. Painted in vivid colors, adorned with feathers and symbols, it carried not just the warrior's body, but his soul into combat. When rider and horse surged together, they were no longer two beings. They were one spirit, fierce and unbreakable. To outsiders, Plains warfare seemed savage. But within the tribes, it was a calling, a sacred trust. Warriors did not fight for conquest or empire. They fought for their people, their land, their honor, and the horse nation that made them strong. When the United States expanded westward, the thunder of horses met the iron march of soldiers. Muskets, revolvers, and cannons now clashed with bows, lances, and swift riders of the plains. At first, the balance leaned toward the tribes. Cavalry units struggled to match the speed and fluid tactics of mounted warriors. Battles like Little Bighorn proved that even well-armed soldiers could be overwhelmed by the fury of riders who struck with precision and vanished before reinforcements arrived. But time favored the invaders. Railroads carved through the prairies, carrying endless supplies, soldiers, and settlers. Guns grew faster, deadlier. The buffalo herds, the lifeblood of the Plains people, were slaughtered by the millions, leaving warriors without food to fuel their resistance. Still, the clashes raged. The Comanche fought relentlessly, earning the title of Lords of the Southern Plains. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho banded together in defiance. Yet with each passing decade, the noose tightened. For every raid, there came retaliation. For every victory, an even greater force was sent. The clash between horseback warriors and iron soldiers was more than a battle of weapons. It was a battle of worlds. One side fought to preserve a way of life born of spirit and freedom. The other fought to impose order, expansion, and control. And as the 19th century drew to its close, it became clear that the age of horseback warfare was reaching its twilight. The final years of Plains warfare were marked by defiance and sorrow. Warriors still rode into battle, their horses painted with symbols of lightning and thunder, but they faced enemies who wielded repeating rifles and endless supplies. The once boundless plains grew smaller, fenced and claimed by settlers. Yet, the spirit of the horse nation did not fade quietly. At battles like the Washita, Rosebud, and Wounded Knee, warriors charged with the same ferocity as their ancestors, even when outnumbered and outgunned. To ride into hopeless battle was not despair, it was honor, the ultimate act of devotion to people and land. When the last great charges ended, the sound of hooves echoing across the prairie fell silent. The horses remained, but their role shifted. The warrior societies diminished, the vast herds of buffalo vanished, and with them, the world that had given rise to horseback warfare. But the legacy never died. Today, the stories of those warriors still ride on the wind. Their tactics, their courage, their bond with the horse nation remain symbols of resistance, resilience, and spirit. The last charge into history was not an ending. It was a transformation, carrying the memory of the Plains tribes into all who remember them. From the first thunder of hooves to the final charge, the Plains tribes turned the horse into a weapon of power, spirit, and survival. They dominated the battlefield, defied empires, and etched their legacy into the story of America itself. What do you think were the Plains warriors the greatest horsemen the world has ever seen? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to join us for more untold histories.